In the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, the US government asked itself, how did this happen? Where did our national security systems fail? The investigations of the 9/11 Commission report revealed some shocking truths. The Federal Bureau of Investigation actually had intelligence on the hijackers, information that could have prevented the attacks. But its technology was so limited that it couldn't connect the dots. The intel was stuck on paper records in FBI offices across the country, with no easy way to share it with other agents. In fact, in the immediate response to the attacks, the FBI had to send dossiers to headquarters via overnight mail. Over the next decade plus, the FBI spent $1 billion trying to modernize their systems and get off of paper records. They failed. Twice. They poured money, time, and effort into years of producing unusable software. But after hitting its head against the wall for 10 years, the FBI did something that no other government agency had done before. It kicked out profiteering contractors, got its hands dirty, and built the system itself at a fraction of the cost. I've been researching and mulling over this story for a while, and I think it's an important case study into why government tends to be so bad at building technology, but also what it looks like when it does it well. I'm Mark Lerner. Let's talk about the FBI. Let's start at the before state. In the year 2000, most modern businesses were using databases, applications, and email to operate. The FBI, however, was not a modern business. Many agents didn't have access to email, and operations still ran on mail and fax. All official records were on paper, and there was no easy way to connect information from different offices. The technology that the FBI did have was so antiquated and hard to use that staff often preferred to keep using paper. To address this, the FBI started a large-scale project to update its technology. Some of this project focused on physical technology infrastructure, things like computers, printers, and networks, but one part was centered on the software that agents would use for their work, the virtual case file, or VCF. The goal was that VCF would let agents do their work on a familiar and modern interface, that data would be stored digitally, and that it would allow for easy sharing of information between offices. The FBI signed a contract with SAIC, a technology development firm, to build the virtual case file at a budget of $170 million. Together, they wrote a massive 800-page requirements document detailing every feature and every function. They formally locked these requirements, no more changes, and got to writing code against that predefined set of specs. It didn't take long, though, for things to go wrong. A whistleblower at SAIC tried to raise concerns, first internally, then publicly. He revealed that SAIC severely overstaffed the project to rack up billable hours, was building insecure software, and was generally burning the FBI's time and money. In his words, the company's attitude was that it's other people's money, so they'll burn it every which way they want to. The FBI kept finding issues with what SAIC was giving them and made over 400 changes to those locked-in requirements through a lengthy change approval process. In December 2003, when SAIC tried to hand over their finished version of the virtual case file, the FBI rejected it, saying it was unacceptable. They sent SAIC back to fix the issues and to test it with a smaller group of agents, but even after working on it for another year, the virtual case file was still slower and more difficult to use than what the FBI already had. In February of 2005, 4 years after starting the project, Congress held a hearing specifically about virtual case file, and FBI Director Robert Mueller admitted its failures. Congress was pissed.
I don't know anybody who's been more supportive the 30 years I've been here of the FBI than I have. Others have been as supportive. I don't know anybody more supportive. And I've been extremely supportive of you. But I'm ready to tear out what little bit of hair I have left. You know, Why didn't you mention any of these problems, all of which were there, when you were asked about the status of the project in May 2004?
Senator, I don't want you to lose less of that hair.
There's not much left, I tell you right now, nor is there the patience.
The next month, the FBI fully canceled the virtual case file program. They completely scrapped everything that SAIC had built, and FBI agents were stuck using old systems and paper. The FBI still needed new tools, so they pretty immediately started working on a new project to build a modern digital case management system. This time, they called it Sentinel. In 2006, they contracted Lockheed Martin to build Sentinel. They broke the work into 4 phases and budgeted a total of $451 million for the program. The FBI did not want to repeat the failures of virtual case file, so it put in place a lot more process and oversight, like a lot more. Over the course of its lifespan, Sentinel had to report to over 20 different oversight groups. The FBI adopted a bunch of different program management methods, including its own homegrown lifecycle management directive process. The procedures it had to go through were so thorough that in the process of developing just the first phase of Sentinel, the FBI and Lockheed Martin produced over 20,000 pages of documentation. That first phase was shipped mid-2007, and in building it, the FBI and Lockheed learned a lot. They decided to relook at that 4-phase plan and break it down even further, splitting phases into segments and then into increments. They also shrunk down the scope of what Sentinel would do as a whole. It would connect with fewer systems, replace fewer systems, and only handle the simplest types of cases, ones that don't have any specific rules. Even with this new plan, though, the development of the second phase didn't go well. Users found the system slow and difficult to use. Lockheed was having a hard time moving data into Sentinel. The FBI staff working on the project turned over at an alarming rate, and the one technical federal employee working on Sentinel was pulled from the project. At the end of 2009, Lockheed Martin delivered the finished Phase 2 of Sentinel, but once again, the FBI found that it was unusable and didn't release it to their staff. They pushed Lockheed Martin to fix it, but it was no use. An independent auditor came in saying that at the rate that Lockheed was going, it would take an additional $351 million and another 6 years to finish Sentinel. Now, in the background of all of this, 3 FBI staff with technical skills had been working together to build an unofficial version of Sentinel. They had their own vision for what it could be, using more modern tools and, critically, more modern methods for building software. Once things started going south with Lockheed, the 3 of them showed their work to FBI executives and convinced them to change course. In September of 2010, the FBI fully took over development of Sentinel. They kicked Lockheed Martin to the curb and brought the project in-house, employing federal staff with tech skills to build the software. They reduced the number of people working on Sentinel from hundreds down to 40. They abandoned the process-heavy management bureaucracy and adopted Agile methods, rapidly building and testing new features, constantly getting feedback from users, and regularly sharing demos of the working product every 2 weeks. They moved the whole team into a single space, the basement of the J. Edgar Hoover FBI headquarters building. The FBI was extremely confident in their new approach, and they set their goals ambitiously. They were going to deliver all of the features and functions originally promised, and they were going to do it fast and dirt cheap. The full budget for Sentinel was $451 million. The FBI had already spent $405 million, and they needed $25 million to maintain what had already been built. That left them with $20 million, and the FBI said that using this new method, with this new team, they could build the whole thing with just that. As a reminder, the independent auditor said that Lockheed Martin could finish it for an additional $351 million. All of those oversight groups from before were not happy about the move away from the familiarity of endless documentation and heavy bureaucratic processes. But FBI leaders pushed back against calls for the team to write a bunch more reports. They protected this tiny team's time, and the team managed to build tools that worked and that their users overwhelmingly liked. The Sentinel they built was a modern application with the feel of Microsoft Outlook circa 2012, and it dramatically improved the operations of the FBI. In July of 2012, this small team finally delivered what SAIC and Lockheed Martin could not: a working, full digital case management system, and they did it for $20 million. The FBI moved off of paper records and retired old and outdated systems in favor of the new Sentinel. FBI agents and caseworkers were able to work much more efficiently, and Sentinel is credited for the rapid identification of the Boston Marathon bombers. So, what happened? Why did the FBI fail to build this thing twice? And how did they not see it coming? Especially with all of the oversight that they had and the detailed management practices they used. Well, those heavy-handed processes and procedures were actually a big part of the issue. The FBI used management methods designed for staying within budget and on schedule by deciding what to build at the very beginning and building exactly that. They finalized the whole set of features, requirements, and schedules ahead of time, and then spent all of their energy tracking whether or not things were going according to that specific plan, regardless of if it was solving real problems or building usable products. This was especially true with Sentinel. The FBI created its own detailed and intense process, the Lifecycle Management Directive, to manage Sentinel. This behemoth of a process had 4 components, 9 phases, 29 acronyms, and an easy-to-follow process chart. The Sentinel team and Lockheed Martin were following this process diligently, and then some. On top of the Lifecycle Management Directive, they also had to calculate earned value, create and update risk registers, manage staffing plans, document enterprise architecture compliance, track a bill of materials, and so on, all of which were exercises in creating documents and reports that ultimately neither reflected the reality of Sentinel's progress nor helped improve its chances of success. Some of these bureaucracies that plagued Sentinel were pushed onto them directly by Congress. Remember when I said that the FBI broke their 4-phase plan down from phases into segments and then increments? Congress pushed for that to happen. When Congress provided funding for Sentinel in 2007, they attached a bunch of requirements to that funding, including breaking up the project into discrete 4-month work packages with explicit start and end dates, costs, and the exact features that would be in each work package. Congress mandated this structure, hoping that it would provide more predictability to the program's cost and schedule. It might not be obvious why this is an issue. After all, don't we want to know what work is happening when and when we can expect to get what we're paying for? The issue is that on a complex project like Sentinel, defining all of the features and functions up front ignores all of the learning and trial and error that will inevitably happen throughout the project. Writer Clay Shirky describes this way of working as a pledge by all parties not to learn anything while doing the actual work. In the development of both the virtual case file and Sentinel, the FBI locked in the hundreds of pages of requirements up front and put in processes that made changing those requirements challenging and costly. Of course, this didn't prevent them from making those changes. I mentioned that VCF had over 400 changes to the requirements, and that was just during the first year. But each of those changes was an unplanned accident, not a purposeful and encouraged evolution. Now, Congress wasn't the only group telling the FBI what bureaucratic processes to follow. The oversight groups that were auditing and assessing their work largely judged them based on how closely they followed prescribed procedures. And as I mentioned, there were a lot of oversight groups. Sentinel had over 20 different offices overseeing its development, including the FBI Management Project Review Board, the Sentinel Risk Review Board, the MITRE Corporation, the Department of Justice Investment Review Board, Congressional Surveys and Investigation Staff, the FBI Enterprise Requirements and Assessment Unit, and more. The Department of Justice's Inspector General was by far the most involved oversight group for Sentinel. They published 10 reports, coming in at over 750 pages, and largely focused on whether the FBI was writing enough documentation or had recently updated its cost or schedule estimates. Other oversight groups, like the Government Accountability Office, basically reported on the same thing. There's 3 issues I want to call out with this level of oversight. First, it pushes the program into these faulty bureaucracies and heavy upfront planning, and it punishes them if they deviate from those processes or plans. Second, it creates a lot of extra work, so much so that for a significant percentage of the federal employees working on Sentinel, their entire jobs were dedicated to creating documentation for oversight. Third, it tends to report on things that are disconnected from the actual success of tech projects, producing documentation that has little to do with whether or not the program is going well. Case in point, the DOJ Inspector General embedded people directly with the Sentinel team, and it published report after report about whether Sentinel was following its own plan and processes, but it barely flagged the actual failures behind the program. In 2010, Congress expressed its disappointment that the IG's office had personnel embedded within the program and yet failed to identify the inherent weaknesses of the FBI's management practices. The thing is, the Office of the Inspector General and almost all of the other oversight groups, they didn't have the technical staff they needed to understand whether the actual technology was being developed well or not. They were experts in public administration, accounting, contract policies, law. That's all valuable expertise, but it doesn't help you when you're trying to see if a tech-based product or service is succeeding. As Nicholas Bagley puts it in his paper, The Procedure Fetish, if all you've got is a lawyer, everything looks like a procedural problem. It's not just the oversight groups that lacked staff with expertise in building digital services. The FBI itself barely had any technical talent engaged with these programs. The head of Sentinel was an accountant. The sole technical federal engineer assigned to the program was removed after only a short period of time because their involvement was deemed unnecessary. And the FBI's chief information officer focused on hiring generalized project managers, not specialized technical leads, to head up tech projects. This, in my mind, is the core failure the FBI suffered. It enabled both SAIC and Lockheed Martin to go years building non-functional software at exorbitant rates without deep inspection or interrogation from government. Without in-house technical talent, the FBI didn't realistically understand how much it should cost to build these systems, how many programmers it would take, or how to best manage its development. From the whistleblower's account, SAIC took advantage of this by staffing over 100 engineers on portions of the project where a dozen would have done. It took outside non-government reviewers with technical staff to point out the technical issues with both Virtual Case File and Sentinel. FBI executives themselves would later admit that they didn't have the engineering talent to pull off a major project like Sentinel. These rigid procedures, restrictive bureaucracies, excessive oversight, and lack of technical talent all weighed these projects down and spelled a doom for both VCF and Sentinel. and yet the FBI pulled it off. But they had to change basically everything about how they were working. Let's go back to when the FBI took over the development of Sentinel. As I mentioned, there were 3 federal employees with technical skills that built their own version of Sentinel. They built their prototype undercover, meaning that they didn't have the burden of oversight or the constraining bureaucracies, and they could move quickly. They showed their prototype to FBI executives, including the FBI's head of IT, who at the time was a recent hire and who came from a technical background. After seeing what a small and agile in-house team could do, the FBI executives decided that this new approach was worth pursuing. There's a lot of benefits to using in-house technical talent, not least of which is the incentives. When a government agency relies on outside consultants to build their system, there's an inherent incentive for that company to find ways to profit as much as possible. And depending on how the contract is written, their profits may have nothing to do with the quality of their work. In this case, SAIC clearly leaned into that incentive, and I'm sure it at least played a part in Lockheed's decisions too. But with the government itself much more involved in building the software, that profit-seeking incentive is reduced or gone. Instead of maximizing profits off of contract technicalities, employees have incentives that more closely align with seeing the program succeed. Even with in-house talent and aligned incentives, though, the Sentinel team was still pushed to spend their time on documentation and rigid procedures by the oversight groups that were overseeing them. But instead of giving in, the new team basically stopped responding to oversight and cut them out of the picture. Because they had drastically reduced the number of people working on the program, they had to significantly drop how much time they were spending on writing reports and generally responding to repetitive and ineffective oversight requests. The Sentinel team told oversight that they were not preparing documentation unless it adds value to the program. Without the shackles of upfront and locked-in processes, the team adopted their much more flexible and modern way of working. They approached the project from an agile perspective, working in 2-week sprints, flexibly prioritizing tasks, engaging directly with users, and adapting their plan rapidly as they ran into challenges. As the FBI's head of technology put it, the agile development process and the agile principles were absolutely critical to our success. I can't imagine going through a change of this magnitude in any organization of this size without that level of prototyping, negotiation, and conversation. Using in-house tech talent, sidelining unhelpful bureaucracy and oversight, adopting modern and flexible processes, those are all huge changes, and none of it would have been possible without one last key ingredient: support from the top. When it came time to decide what to do in the face of Sentinel's impending failure, it wasn't the trio of technical staff that made the decision, nor the head of Sentinel, nor the chief information officer of the FBI. It was the director of the bureau himself, Robert Mueller. See, Robert Mueller had been the face of these efforts over basically his entire term at the FBI. He became director a week before 9/11, and since then had been a constant presence on Capitol Hill talking about the virtual case file and Sentinel programs, among other things. When timelines slipped and budgets ballooned, it was Mueller that testified to Congress. When virtual case file totally collapsed, Mueller took the blame. When Sentinel looked like it was following the same path, he was the one that stood up for the program. And when it came time to completely change how things were going, he was ultimately the one on the hook for whether it worked or not. That executive buy-in was what let the FBI take drastic measures. It provided the cover the Bureau needed to piss off the oversight groups, kick Lockheed Martin out, and put its faith in a small and empowered team of dedicated technical civil servants. What really stuck with me about this story is when it all happened. The FBI took over development of Sentinel in 2010, over 3 years before the massive healthcare.gov failure. It used modern practices and built a complex system for a fraction of the expected cost with a tiny team of empowered people 16 years ago, well before the federal government kicked off larger efforts to hire technical talent and change how it built software. And yet, after the surprise success of Sentinel, government continued to build software the same old way and repeated the same types of failures. This story, this case study, as impressive as it is, wasn't a beacon of change for the rest of government, but it is a very early example of how our government can build technology well. Frankly, you could have placed this story this year. Government tries to build software, vendor under-delivers, government overpays, and a small empowered team of civil servants got the job done. But that it happened in 2010 blew my mind, and I'm grateful I could learn about it and share it with you. There were so many things I couldn't fit into this story. The revolving door of executives between the FBI and the private sector, the effects that double-crossing spies had on virtual case file, accidental massive network outages, mainframe computers, the Chadster and techno boondoggles. But there are also a bunch more stories like this out there. If you know of a project that's fallen into this pattern, let me know in the comments below. And if you found this interesting, consider sending it to someone that you think would like it. Thanks.